Mr. Jim Gerritt as our keynote speaker.
Give you a little bit of a promotion. I was actually an editorial writer and columnist for the Free Press for 10 or 15 years, and that's when I did a lot of writing about the prison system. And about a year and a half ago, I went to the Blade to become the deputy editor. One of the reasons I left, quite frankly, was because I was writing too much about prisons. I mean, the editors were telling me, stop writing about this stuff so much. You're writing too much about prisons. We like what you do, but enough is enough. And they put a little pressure on me to slow that down and take to it real well. So there was another opening at the Toledo Blade for a deputy editor and considerably more money, so I just took it. But he's right, that was my passion there for 15 years. I wrote about the prison system. Probably the only person besides an employee of the Department of Corrections that's been in every prison in Michigan. There's 32 of them now. I've been to every single one of them. And going in and talking to the inmates, basically. Also invited in as a speaker. In fact, usually when I do any kind of public speaking, I've got a bunch of guys in front of me with orange uniforms on with numbers in their back. So, it's good to talk to some people that can leave at the end of the session. But yeah, I have, that was a tireless crusade of mine, and he's right, it doesn't get enough publicity. People don't necessarily want to hear about it, and, well, I'm not so sure they don't want to hear about it, because a lot of people do want to hear about it, but people in the media, editors think that, that people don't want to hear about it. It's not uplifting, it's depressing. But I've always tried to write about things giving people some hope. You can write about these issues because there is a lot of hope, because people are struggling, they're overcoming things, and you know about that much better than I do. You guys live with it, you're advocates, you know about this issue a lot more than I do. And one of the inspirations I've always had in writing about this stuff is meeting people like you who are working hard, overcoming things. The maze of obstacles that people meet. I apologize, I forgot that it's very bad manners.
Should we answer for you?
Yeah. I don't know what that is. Maybe a bill collector or something. Let me just start by telling you how I sort of got on this issue, because people ask me a lot, and I'm not going to talk very long. I want to just make a few points, and then you can ask me. And why are you so interested in this prison thing? And I had a brother-in-law in prison, still is in prison. I go see him. But I started with this when I started my journalism career 25 years ago. A little town called Oshkosh. And they were opening a medium security prison up there. And I got a real good relationship with the warden. And he said, hey, when we open this up, if you want to spend a week here, 2 weeks here, you can. Now, he wouldn't let me sleep there, but for 2 weeks, because of liability, they didn't want to take that on. But for 2 weeks, I could just walk around, I could talk to inmates, I could talk to staff. Total freedom, much more freedom than I've ever had since. When you think about the restrictions that are on prisons right now, to have that kind of ability is amazing. So I spent 2 weeks in that prison just talking to people, inmates mostly, but also staff. And I wrote a long series. I wish I could have had that kind of opportunity to do that now, when I had some skills. Just a young cub reporter at that time. But we did a long series on it, and it was pretty good. And it really got me interested in corrections. And at that time, this was in the mid-'80s, when there were, I think, in Wisconsin, 5,000 inmates. Now there are probably 25,000. The prison population has quadrupled over the last 30 years. We've gone on this mass binge of mass incarceration where we just want to lock everybody up and throw away the key. And it's had a horrible impact on the entire society. I mean, not only are we spending all this money to lock people up, it costs $35,000 a year to lock each prisoner up. $35,000 a year. Just think what you could do with that kind of money, in outpatient community treatment stuff. Michigan spends $1.5 billion a year on prisons. That's more than it spends on higher education. It's only one of 6 states that spends more on prisons and higher education. But this happens all over the country. So we're spending this enormous amount of money on this incarceration binge. And by the way, this didn't happen because there was more crime. I mean, there wasn't some genetic change in people that made them more dangerous and violent over the past 30 or 40 years. This happened because of deliberate changes in public policy and sentencing. What the crime rate is, there's so much in the media about violent crime, so we think we live in this vast, dangerous world. If you ask most people, are we living in a more dangerous world than we were 30 years ago? They'd say, yeah, no doubt. But we've got this 24/7 news cycle. We're not. The statistics are violent crime is actually down from what it was 30 or 40 years ago. But this mass incarceration, this binge we've gone on, has been because of 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimum sentences, more people with mental illness being in prison. That's what's driven it, not crime. So I've seen over my course of the career this mass increase in incarceration, and it's a huge issue. I really don't know why the media doesn't spend more time on it, because if you just look at the dollars and cents that we're spending, it should be a huge issue. And then, of course, we're tearing up communities. My brother-in-law, who grew up on the east side of Detroit, told me that everybody he knew went to prison. He didn't know one person, one peer that didn't go to prison. And that's because it's become a norm in so many of our communities. We've taken so many men out of our communities that they're fatherless. So many kids are growing up fatherless. And if you have a parent that's incarcerated, you're 7 times more likely to go to prison yourself. And I'm not saying everybody that went to prison is an innocent victim of the system. That's not true at all. But these deliberate policies have driven this, and it's had an enormous cost in our society. Now, one of the things, and you know this better than I do, and the reason, there's 25% of the people in prison are mentally ill. That's what the Department of Corrections will tell you. And that's what most states have. Now, if you go to county jails, it's more than that. It's more like 40%. 40% of the population are mentally ill. And you talk to any sheriff in any county, in any state, they will all have this one line that they come up with. I run the biggest mental health clinic in my county. Because it's true. There are more mentally ill people in the county jails than there are in any other institution in the county. But it's not true because there's no treatment. They're there, but they're not getting treatment. Especially in jail. Even jail less than prison. So we've got this huge amount of people that are mentally ill in prisons and jails. And that, of course, and again, you know this better than I do, we had this grand deinstitutionalization 20 or 30 years ago, where people said, well, let's stop warehousing mentally ill people. And that was a good idea. There were too many people that were locked up in these one flew over the cuckoo nest type places. But the bargain was, if we close all these mentally ill institutions, state psychiatric hospitals, and between 1987 and 2003, Michigan closed 12 of its 16 state psychiatric hospitals. The bargain was, we'll close these, we'll save all this money, but we'll take a little bit of that money and we'll put it into community-based treatment so that we can more cost-effectively and humanely treat people with mental illnesses. That didn't happen. What they did is they closed the state psychiatric hospitals and they didn't do the community treatment side. I'm speaking in generalities. They did a little bit of it, yeah, but not much. And that's why so many of those people, instead of ended up being treated, ended up in our county jails, in our state prisons, in our homeless shelters. I mean, just walking in any, I lived in the city of Detroit for 12 years. And by the way, I'm the biggest booster of the city of Detroit in the world. I love that city. It broke my heart to leave it. It really did. But if you walk in any homeless shelter in the city of Detroit, I mean, it's the people, 3/4, so many people, they're off their meds, it's sad. It's really sad, and it's worse than it being in a county jail. So we didn't do that bargain. And now we're starting to realize that a little bit, and we're coming around and doing it. Now Tyrone just told me, and you ought to be congratulated for this, that guys just got a mental health court in Washtenaw County. And I'm sure that was a result of a lot of your efforts doing that. That is a great thing, because what I want to talk a little bit about prisons, and that's one thing that I probably know a little bit more. I think you know more about this issue than I do. I think I know a little bit more about the prison system probably than anybody in this room. Prisons are, if there's one thing I want you to remember from this discussion, prisons are not built for treatment. They're built for security. And we can talk about reforms and getting mentally ill people out of segregation and giving them access to medication, psychotropic medication, and making sure that when they get out, that immediately there's somebody there to take them to get their meds and to get them into treatment. But no matter how well we reform the system, it won't be a treatment center. It will still be a prison. If a prison has a budget cut, which they all do, and they have to cut 5 security guards or 2 treatment workers, guess what? It's always going to be the 2 treatment workers that are cut. Always. Because prisons are built for security. They're not built for treatment. So what that means is that part of your struggle has to be to reform the prison system. But the larger battle is to get mentally ill people out of prison, to divert them, to make sure that they don't get there in the first place, in general. And a drug court, I've been working on an addiction series right now, so if I talk about addiction instead of mental health, excuse me. But a mental health court is really one of the best ways to do that. And so you're to be congratulated. They work really well. There's one in Wayne County I observed that was marvelous. They had a marvelous judge, they had a marvelous probation worker. A lot of it depends on who you get. But you get the focus. You get everybody there has the expertise. Everybody there has the community contacts. Everybody there has the desire to help mentally ill people. And it works, generally speaking, to divert it. But you also got to make sure, too, now that you have this wonderful mental health court, that there are community-based treatment options for that court. Because if a judge diverts somebody from prison to the community, you got to make sure that there's some place there for that person to go, that there's some treatment options for them. So you need not only the mental health court, but the increase in community treatment options. Have you all heard of Timothy Souders? Anybody here? Yeah. That was sort of probably the biggest story I've ever been on in my life. The day after I did it, I got a call from 60 Minutes. And that was kind of bizarre, working with 60 Minutes they did a follow-up piece on it. And about 4 months later, and the day after I got that, I had to leave my office because the phone was ringing so much, and the guy from 60 Minutes didn't get a hold of me. And then 6 months later, by the way, somebody sent me a press release saying, there's a story about Timothy Souders on 60 Minutes. Be sure to watch it. It's a Michigan case. And they were trying to make sure I knew about it. So that was a bit humbling. You think you work for the Free Press and that a lot of people read you. And that was why I was happy to work with 60 Minutes, because I knew they had a bigger microphone. This guy was, when we do stories on inmates, when I do stories on inmates, I try to pick people who are really right for the case. Someone who can really illustrate the case and will be somewhat sympathetic to the public, because the public is not always sympathetic to inmates. For example, I will generally stay away from people that are convicted of sexual crimes when I do these profiles. Not because I don't think people who commit sexual crimes have the same right to treatment and rights as everybody else, but I know that the general public, they pick that up. They see pedophilia or something, who cares? So you look for people who are just right for what you want to do it. This guy was, if you wanted a case of what was wrong with the prison system in Michigan, that was it. He was 21 years old. He had been in prison, in and out of the court system 16 times for BS, bullshit stuff. I mean, it was, disorderly conduct. The thing that got him into prison was stealing a paintball gun from Myers. But the judge kind of looked at this and said, look, you've been here 14 times. I don't know what to do with you. And this is what happens with mentally ill. Is they act out, they're up, he was bipolar, he had a number of other things. And they get disorderly and they keep coming back to the court. The judge gets frustrated and just says, you're going to prison. So he got a 1 to 4 year sentence for stealing a paintball gun from Myers. 1 to 4 year prison sentence. Then when he was in the county jail, and this goes back to what I'm talking about, jails and prison aren't for treatment. It's also probably because of the mentality of the people who work there. They're corrections officers. They don't like you to call them guards. They will, don't call me a guard, I'm a corrections officer. Because we're treating, but their main focus is turnkey, keep the person locked up. They're not treatment workers. So when he was in the Leelanau County Jail, he was there off his medication, depressed, and he tried to commit suicide. So he took his jail uniform and cut it up and made an inept attempt to make a noose around his neck and hang himself. And of course, the guards saw him and cut him down and he lived. But what would you do if someone committed suicide, or tried to commit suicide? You try to help them, would you? I mean, you'd say, what's wrong? That's not what people do. What they did instead was they charged him with malicious destruction of police property. Now, because you see he had ripped up his jail uniform, that's police property. So when you hear that sounds, malicious destruction of police property, man, that sounds like somebody trying to blow up a police station. That sounds like some terroristic act. That's why when you see all these charges, just kind of look behind them and see what they are. So instead of giving this guy treatment, they charged him with malicious destruction of police property. And then he went to prison, and of course he did not get treated there. He didn't get his medications, and it was a death sentence. A 1 to 4 year sentence turned into a death sentence. The Michigan Department of Corrections killed him. He murdered. I want to read you just the first couple of graphs. I found this just before I was getting here. So this was from 2007, and this is just sort of describes his death. Timothy Joe Souders lived a hard life and on August 6th died an even harder death in a segregated prison cell in Jackson. Souders, 21, spent most of his last 4 days naked, without physicians or psychiatric care, his arms and legs bound in a steel bed in 4-point restraints. He was in a bare, all-steel isolation cell about the size of a walk-in closet. He went to the cell August 2nd because of unruly behavior. He lay in urine, agitated, disoriented, psychotic, as the cell felt close to 106 degrees at the time, according to a report written by a federal monitor. Souders was found dead on his bed around 4 p.m., 2 hours after staff had removed his shackles. That's how he died. And his mother found out how he died at the funeral when someone walked up to her and said, handed her this. That's how she learned how he died. The Department of Corrections would not even tell her how he died. They told her he was dead, it was an accident, but they didn't tell her how he died. So that's how she found out. So this is what I mean when I say prisons are not built for treatment. They're built for security. And we have to do everything we can to divert people who are mentally ill away from them. Now, I don't know how you all feel about in psychiatric hospitals. I think, and I've been away from this issue a while, but I think there's some dispute or disagreement in the mental health community about how easy it should be, excuse me, to commit somebody to a hospital. I mean, there's some real civil libertarian ACLU type concerns here. I mean, back in the 50s, all you really had to do was say, my brother's nuts. I heard him talking to himself. And they'd let, I'm exaggerating, but it was very easy to get committed in the 50s. And it was, there was a huge amount of abuses. But there may be an issue, some people in the mental health community feel now that it might be too difficult to get people inpatient help. And there has to be a little bit easier way to get a civil commitment. And I don't know how you feel about that. I don't know how I feel about that. But it's an issue that's out there. As I said before, Michigan closed 12 of the state psychiatric hospitals, 12 to 16 between 87 and 2003. We've got 25% of the state prison inmates now who are mentally ill, and 1/3 of the county jails. Michigan has, I think, the 6th fewest number of beds, inpatient psychiatric hospital beds per capita in the country. So there's a real question here, and I'd kind of like to hear how you all feel about that, about whether we need to build more inpatient psychiatric beds. I mean, the outpatient is where most people belong. They can be treated with the psychotropic medication we have now. They can be treated much more cost effectively, much more humanely in the community. But some people need inpatient. Just like some drug addicts need to be in an inpatient rehab for only 2 weeks a month before they can go outpatient. We closed too many of the hospitals too fast. I think we can all agree with that in any case. So we need to get a better basis of inpatient community, outpatient community treatment, better network of that, and more drug courts that can divert people. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say as far as the prison system. Does anybody have any questions about anything? We can look towards solutions. I think mental health courts are certainly one of them. We need to have police much better trained to deal with mental health people. One of the unintended consequences of this is who is the first responders to mental health right now? It's not the social worker, it's not a treatment worker, it's a cop. They're the first responders. They're the people that first see mentally ill people. And they're not trained to deal with it. And they don't even know where they can get help. Now in Detroit, there was a pilot program that had mental health caseworkers go out on patrols with police officers. It was a pilot program that was federally funded. I'm not sure what the results were with it, but I wrote along on one of them, and it seemed to work very well. But cops have to have a basic understanding too, because until we get the system right, they're going to continue to be first responders. We need to get the Michigan Department of Corrections to generally ban segregation for mentally ill inmates. Right now they don't. And there's probably at least 200 right now, as we speak, mentally ill people in segregation, where they're there for 23 hours a day. And if they are in segregation, they need to be seen 3-4 times a day by a nurse and make sure they got their medication if they are in segregation at all. So those are some of the issues I wanted to raise about prisons and mental health. Does anybody here have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
In the series that you're doing on addiction
Yes.
now, does any part of it include the mental health component combined with the addiction issues?
Indirectly, yeah, because there's so much of it is dual diagnosis. When you go into a mental health court or you go into an addiction court, they're working together. In fact, in Ohio, they actually combined the units in the state administration that work with addiction and work with mental health, because they found out that so much of it was interrelated that they wanted the people working together. So in these drug courts that are run around the state, even though they're primarily dealing with drug addiction, they do also deal with mental health as well. There is a mental health component as well, because, as you know, mental illness is what drives some people to addiction. And certainly, when you're addicted, it's certainly going to compound your recovery. So it's very much, I think they say that at least 1/3 to 40% of people who have a drug addiction also have a mental health issue as well. So, yeah, it's not as good as it should be, but people are aware of that, and they are working on it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
I would add to that a third leg to that stool, which is physical health. So try.
Yes, yes, you're right. And that series that I did on Souders, what I just mentioned on Souders, that was not a mental health series. That was a prison healthcare series. And prison and healthcare in the prison system is horrible. And what they're trying to do right now to save money is privatize it. And they have privatized it in Michigan. Corrections Medical Service had the contract. They had the contract until my series. And they lost it because of my series. But when I go into prisons now to talk to other people, inmates, they say it's not any better now than it was before. So sometimes you wonder how much you do. You know, you write this series, and then the Department of Corrections shows you all these wonderful things they're doing because of it. They've got an ombudsman for health now. They've got this, they've got that, you got this. And then you go into the prisons and talk to the inmates, and they say it's no better. It's even worse. So sometimes you wonder what you're doing. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about the police academies. Is there any, do you know of any support that, or education that's given through police academies, and also criminal justice programs, the 4-year degrees? My son goes to Western, and even his brother's affected.
Yes.
He's not being educated on, and he's going to be a police officer.
He is not?
He is not. I believe he's not. Criminal justice education, I just wondered, is it incorporated, mental health and things along that nature?
Well, where's did you say it was your brother?
My son, my other son,
Your
his
son.
brother.
Okay.
So I'm trying to educate him, but it's like, hey, you're a criminal justice major, and so I just wondered, how does that integrate in the education system producing police officers?
Yeah, well, that was one of the recommendations that the series put forward, and I talked to the police chief about it. There has been very little up until now, but cops are very much aware, especially beat cops. They know they're dealing with a lot of mentally ill people. And yeah, the police academies are starting to incorporate training for mental health and addiction in the academy, and so are corrections officers for the prisons. But it's a slow process, and it depends upon what jurisdiction you're in. I mean, every city, every municipality has a different police academy, and there's not a uniformity of it. But I would say that they're starting to do it, they're doing more of it, but it's spotty, and that's one thing you could all advocate for, is better mental health training for cops. Because until the system gets right, they're going to still continue to be first responders, and up till now they haven't gotten much training. But they are aware of the need for it. If you talk to any police chief, any sheriff, any warden, they say, yeah, we need this and we're trying to get it. Yes, sir?
What is the cause of most incarcerations?
What is the cause?
Yeah, what kind of people are?
Drugs.
Drugs, not normally?
Yes, drugs. If you look at, when I say drugs, I mean that covers a lot of range. That could be a kingpin dealer to someone who's possessed, just possession. But 2/3 of the people in prison are there for drug-related crimes.
And for mentally ill people, does that same thing apply, or is there some other reason for incarceration?
Well, that's a good question, because just because someone is mentally ill does not mean could be a danger to society. It could be, is it appropriate to lock somebody up for a mental illness if they commit a violent crime? Are they still responsible? I mean, that's a debate. That's a debate that's going on with the drug addiction. But 2/3 of the people that are in prison are for drug-related crimes. I would say, and then of course, 80% of those in prison have drug or alcohol problems. So it's all kind of interrelated. I just did a story on someone from the series I'm doing on who got a 4-year prison sentence for possession. And it shows you, it just depends so much on the judges and the counties where a person is sentenced. One person in one county might go to prison for one crime. In another county, for the exact same crime, or even less, they might go to treatment. It depends on the judge. It depends on the community-based treatment. It depends on so many things. There's no uniformity in this. But people that are mentally ill that are in prison are generally like souders. They're not dangerous, at least not when they're on their medications, but they're disorderly. And they're repeat offenders. They offend time and time again. And the judges get frustrated with them and just say, you know, you've been here 15 times, nothing's working. You're going to prison. But there are mentally ill people that also commit violent crimes. And that's where the question gets a little bit stickier. What should happen to them? Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you. I have read basically what you've written.
Thank you.
And I thought the fact that you're bringing awareness, whether it changes, I don't know. But the other thing I wanted to stress, now I have a bipolar son who just started community college, which is like, wow.
Yeah.
We got you there.
That's great.
I had a brother who died of bipolar because he became addicted to crack and alcohol. And he was in and out of the jail system. And I had a father, bipolar, who died from addiction. So, you know, to me, there is it's self-medicating.
Yeah.
It's self-medicating. But my point is this. I'm all for that. I mean, people need to be educated. It should not be a stigma. It needs education. And I'm about to be a commissioner on the disability for the Commissioner Board Disability. And one of the things, what I want to bring to it is I want to partner with NAMI and get mental health really acknowledged, because it's a disease that you don't see. And that said, I am a student advocate, education advocate. And what happened to my son in the school system was reprehensible. They don't know what to do with the kids who are mentally ill. And so I go back to, okay, what did you learn about mental illness when you were getting your degree? I don't know, 2 days. So there's no education for the teachers. So here they're giving a child who's mentally, and all they want is for them to go out. They don't want that. So my question then is, you know, I'm trying to figure out what can we offer. Well, number one, the teachers just need to be trained. And number two, what are we going to offer these children? I mean, there's got to be a plan. There's got to be some way that they are not pushed out of the system. I mean, my son attempted suicide because he was pushed out of the system. He didn't make it, thank God. But do you know what I'm saying? Suicide, how?
Yeah.
I mean, so the change is not in prison as well. In some ways, it started with education. It's you know, I just think they're very similar, and I don't know what to say about it.
Well, you're right. There's a horrible stigma, and that's one thing you all got to work on. Working with families when I was doing that series on criminalizing addiction, it would tell me, you know, how stigmatizing this is, and just how, you know, ashamed they were to bring things out. And it's the same thing with drug addiction. I mean, this woman I'm working on now that had a son that overdosed on heroin. She did not talk about addiction because she was a second grade teacher. She thought the parents of her students would think she's an unfit teacher because their son had a heroin addiction. So there's all these stigmas around that people have, and that's what's so great about what you're doing, because you're educating people that you need to get over this. And one of the things that struck me when I did this series in Detroit on mental health was, you know, because they always stick my bald head on the collar so people can, although I always wear hats so people know I'm great. I had so many people come up to me and say, I've got a son or a daughter that did this. They tell me this story. And I was just amazed that I would say at least 30 or 40 people in the course of 6 months came up, and people that were, you know, like Target, someone who was checking me out at the cashier. that they all had these stories that they weren't being told, that nobody knew about. And they felt so isolated. Because, where's the support? But yeah, I mean, teachers have to, just like corrections officers and police officers, they have to be educated on this. Because people can do wonderful things, great things. I mean, if they're allowed to do it.
They know how to do it.
And if the proper treatment, and you can't let society's failures, pull them down or keep them from what they can be. That's what's so heroic about, what you guys are doing. I mean, you work with it directly every day. So, I can't really give you an answer except to agree with you, to say that, yeah, teachers need to be educated on this and the stigma has to be gone down and people have to lose this stigma, this feeling of isolation that they have. Because it's so prevalent. Everybody knows somebody who's addicted to drugs, who's in prison, who's had a mental health issue, whether they know it or not. There's 500,000 seriously mentally ill people in Michigan. 500,000, that's the estimate. That's a lot of people.
Thank you very much, Jeff.